Welcome to this first video in our 4-part expert consult series this month, where we are going to be talking to experts in the fields of sleep, medicine, and psychology. Today, we're joined by Professor Michael Gradisar. Professor Gradisar has been a sleep researcher and clinical psychologist, specializing in insomnia, circadian rhythms, light therapy, and technology. His group was the first research team to test whether the blue light emitted from screens affects people's sleep in the hour before bed. He is considered a world expert on the topic of technology use in sleep and uses his own and others' scientific findings in his clinical practice to improve sleep. He is also the CEO of Wink Sleep Online. So welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to have Professor Michael Gradisar here with me today. And he is a researcher, he's a clinician, he's an educator, he's an author, and he has one of the best blogs out there on sleep science, which is the Wink Sleep blog. So if you're not a subscriber, go ahead and subscribe to his blog because you will learn so much about sleep science and also actionable tips that you can use for yourself and for your patients in clinic. So thank you, Professor, for joining me today.
And thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad that we can finally meet.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, we've been interacting online for some time now and, enjoying each other's content. And, I've been learning so much from your blog, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad that at least one person reads them.
Right. Yeah, you've got one subscriber here for sure.
Yeah.
So, Michael, I would like to hear a little bit more about how you got into sleep. I know you've been in this field for a number of years now, and you've had various sorts, you worked in different aspects in universities and in clinics. So how did you get into this, and what has your journey been with sleep science?
Yeah, well, I think the hook was really when I was doing my undergrad degree at Flinders Uni, and in third year I took a sleep topic, and that was instructed by Professor Leon Lack. And I just remember going to the lectures and just absolutely looking forward to it and loving it and just being hooked in and just absolutely entertained. And I guess the other thing is that Leon he is a great storyteller, and I think that sort of really shines through in his lectures, when he's doing media interviews, even when he's writing a research paper. He knows how to tell a story and sort of capture your attention. And so, from there, eventually I ended up working in his lab in 1998. That's when I started, just being a research assistant there. And then the person that was running the project left, and I ended up sort of going up and running the project for him, and then escalating that to a PhD with him, really looking at circadian rhythms and napping and so forth. And then I ended up doing my Masters of Clinical Psych, so training to be a psychologist. And when I had managed to finish that, and I was still just completing my PhD, Leon was actually doing CBT for insomnia and light therapy as well for circadian rhythm disorders at a sleep clinic. And so he invited me along, and I sort of learned on the job really back then. So I've been doing that for 20 years. And then finally everything came to a close around 2005, and I finished all my qualifications and training, and there was a job that was available at Flinders Uni. It was actually in child psychology. And so I ended up learning about child sleep. And so now it was a case of where I was doing research and clinical work from infancy through to adulthood. And you know what it's like, you get hooked onto sleep and it's hard to get out.
That's exactly right. I mean, sleep is such a fascinating area. And one thing I find so interesting about it is that it is truly multidisciplinary. So you have psychologists, pulmonologists, neurologists, psychiatrists like myself, and you can come at it from so many different angles. And I think that's why we get sucked into it, is because, sleep is kind of like, space exploration. There's still so much we don't know about it.
One of the great things I think about having a lectureship in an academic career was that I then got to sort of think about all the things I wanted to research, and had a lot of autonomy to do that. And like I said, start to explore. And I think that was really cool back then, because there were so many areas to sort of explore that weren't that sort of filled up yet. And I guess, we're going to talk about some of that today.
You're incredibly knowledgeable about sleep, and there are so many different aspects of sleep that we could talk about. But one area that I would like to focus in on is screen time and blue light and the effects of blue light on sleep, because there's so much information out there about blue light and how it affects sleep and how you shouldn't use screens at night. And, popular science is kind of, there's all these articles about it. People ask me about it all the time. And it almost seems like blue light is the new gluten, right? Like you should avoid it at all costs. But you have said that the effects of blue light on sleep is actually one of the biggest sleep myths out there. So #1 sleep myth out there. So can you tell us about that and what you mean by that?
Yeah, so it really sort of started when we went to do a study on this, because we noticed that when we looked at the literature, looking at basically the light that comes from screens, and just to sort of give some sort of background here, yes, when you've got things like an iPad, for instance, which is what we tested, and you have a look at the sort of colors of light that are emitted by that, you do have this sort of very narrow amount of blue, but a lot of it that is actually projected from those screens and can be received at the eyes. Relative to the other colors of the rainbow, really, that comes from screens. So we noticed that there wasn't that many studies. In fact, there were no studies at all. As much as people were sort of talking about it back in 2011, they weren't directly testing this. Excuse me. And so we thought, well, I guess we better go and test it. And so we got some teenagers and we brought them into our sleep lab. And on different nights, we gave them an iPad. So on one night it was bright, another it was really dim. And on another night, what we did is we installed this app that helped to reduce those blue emissions of this light. And back then, Apple hadn't invented night shift mode. So we had to basically use f.lux. And the people from f.lux were really great, in collaborating with us and helping us, get all the sort of readings from the iPads as well, and during the whole publication process. So they did that in the hour before bed, the usual sort of bedtime. And then we also had EEG. So we're measuring their sleep with the most precise sort of measure. And when we crunched the data, the difference between the conditions was not many minutes at all. So even though we were reducing blue light or dimming the light, we were only getting a difference of like 4 minutes in the time taken to fall asleep. And we're like, really? Wow. But in some ways, on reflection, one thing we had to do when we were writing up the article for publication is that we measured the intensity of that light that was received at the eyes. And it wasn't actually that intense, sort of rewind back to when I was saying we were working with circadian rhythms and using bright light therapy. The amount of bright light that we were using was around about sort of 1,000 lux if it was indoor light. And, you go outside, you can get multiples of 10,000 lux. But we could only get a maximum of 80 lux from these iPads. It was really, really hard. And so it sort of made sense that, okay, maybe that's why we didn't see much of an effect. And I think that's what people have to understand, is that when it comes to the whole recommendation of not using a screen before bed, it's don't use something that's really stimulating before bed. There's been that sort of concept of don't watch a scary movie before bed, don't obviously have caffeine before bed, don't go and run a marathon before bed. They're all sort of very stimulating sort of things. And that's probably the concept behind this whole blue light from the screens. And what it should do, if it's really alerting, is that it should take a long time to fall asleep. And we didn't see that. And what was interesting is that over the years, because we had published that study and we were the first ones to publish it, this was in 2014, then I started receiving all of the manuscripts of other people that were testing it, because, I'd done it myself. And I was just noticing the same thing was happening. Other people were finding very similar results. And it was really a great sort of way to have a look at how science works. One concept of science is, you get research from independent groups, different samples, different methods. And then it became clear that regardless of whether you were using f.lux, night shift mode, blue blocking glasses, whether you're doing it in a lab, whether you're doing it in the home environment, whether you were doing it with people with insomnia, athletes, teenagers, adults, they were all showing the same thing. They weren't really affecting the time taken to fall asleep. And then that's happened over the last, say, several years in the scientific literature that, a lot of it is behind paywalls, so people can't really access it. But for some strange reason, people have been promoting this throughout the internet. And I think when I first got on LinkedIn, I was trying to sort of correct people's information. It's like, actually, that's not true. We did this study. Here it is. And then I found myself suddenly getting debated with this research, and people are trying to find, some sort of fault in it. And people really feel strongly about it, even though it really is a mismatch with the scientific data. So hence why when I was going to start to write a blog about it, on the Wink website, I thought, how do you capture people's information? How do you break through the noise of the internet? And I said, well, stuff it. I'll call it the #1 sleep myth. And that did attract attention, and it also attracted debate.
I remember that. I remember when you posted that on LinkedIn, and yeah, there was so much engagement. I would, guess that was probably one of your most, your posts with the most engagement that you've ever gotten. Is that accurate?
It was actually the second most one that attracted a lot of engagement. There was another controversial one that we could probably talk about another time, but it certainly had its effect, on the different sort of streams, not just on LinkedIn, but also on Twitter. I found that a lot of other sleep researchers on Twitter were really like, hang on, they're having all these debates about it. And I was like, oh, guys, but this is what the data's saying. Like, I know you want to sort of say this and direct the public towards this, but this is the data. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it's just become so pervasive in our culture that blue light is bad. It's bad for sleep. And it certainly does have effects on melatonin, which I want to talk about in a moment. But I think what you alluded to is really important with regard to understanding the brightness of the screen. So when we're using bright light therapy for circadian rhythm management or for depression, we're using devices that emit like 5,000 or 10,000 lux. On a bright, on a cloudy day outside, it's maybe 20,000 lux. On a bright sunny day, it's maybe 100,000 lux. And as you said, if you're looking at an iPad, that's about 80 lux. So it's a fraction of the brightness that we actually use, for circadian rhythm management. So we do know that blue light suppresses melatonin. So could you speak to that, and how does that fit into this idea that blue light is maybe not as bad as it could be at night, or that maybe screens aren't as bad as people might think at night, but if it's suppressing melatonin, then how does that all work?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is where, I mean, you sort of mentioned before, we don't know everything when it comes to sleep. And this is something that we probably still need to know as researchers. But I think what the public understands is that there is a perfect correlation between the amount of melatonin you have and your ability to fall asleep. And the research when it comes to the screen technology use, the same sort of research that we conducted and other people have conducted, keeping in mind we didn't actually look at melatonin, but other studies have looked at melatonin. And what should happen is that as you are approaching sleep, you should have this natural rise in melatonin. And it is true that when you have a bright screen in these studies, the rise isn't so steep. It's just a bit more flat. So there's still melatonin there. It doesn't turn it off. It actually is just a bit more flat. But regardless of that, and it is statistically significant, although there's still melatonin there, but it's not really affecting the time taken to fall asleep, regardless of what the melatonin levels are. And as you rightly pointed out, we use bright light to, say, for instance, if someone has advanced sleep phase syndrome and they're falling asleep really early and waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, then we do bright light therapy. And we give them bright light in the hour before bed, and we push that later and later and later. So we're pushing the circadian rhythm later. But like you said, we're using hundreds, if not thousands of lux to be able to do that. When I said before that we measured the lux of the iPad screen, I distinctly remember I was in the bedroom and it was all dark. And I had the iPad with a certain screen on, and I just had it resting nice and comfortably, and it was way lower than 80 lux. I had to turn the brightness up completely full. I had to find a completely white screen, and I had to bring it closer to my face. And I had to then bring my knees up and rest it comfortably there, because we had to ask the teenagers to keep it 40 centimeters away from their face for a whole hour, and that's not comfortable. And having it fully bright isn't even comfortable. So I really doubt people do that. But even so, it's still only 80 lux. It's just not bright enough. And as much, like we're saying, as much as it might sort of reduce the amount of melatonin, the melatonin is still there. And regardless, it doesn't affect the time taken to fall asleep.
Right. Yeah. And I know part of your, or maybe there was a different study where you actually looked at how many consecutive nights you need to use a screen in order to delay your circadian phase. So could you tell us a little bit about that study and what you found?
Yeah, I think this was a really good study, because I think after we did our study, and we also collaborated with Christian Kaioken, who's in Basel in Switzerland, because he had done a previous study looking at this, but he actually didn't measure sleep, but he did measure melatonin. And one of his team, Stephanie Vanderlele, in 2015, she managed to do what I thought was a fantastic study, because she was doing half-an-hour measurements, looking at melatonin, looking at different ways of how people were alert before bedtime, and measured sleep. Again, found a reduction in melatonin, but didn't necessarily find an effect on the time taken to fall asleep. But the thing with our studies were that we were testing different sort of ways of looking at this iPad or using blue blocking glasses or an app on single nights separated by a week. So it's just like a single test. So it's really good in terms of controlling the environment and trying to learn cause and effect. But this is not what people do in the real world. They will use it night after night after night. And so there was a study by Anne-Marie Chang from Harvard, and it was a great study because what it did is that it tested people on two different conditions: reading, a printed book in dim light versus reading an ebook. And they did it for 5 consecutive nights, each of these conditions, swapped it around. It was a beautiful study. And obviously you need a lot of money to do that as well. I think our study, I think it cost like $1,000 to $1,500 to do. We're very fortunate that it was a student project and we had multiple students looking at it. So that's where I guess a lot of stuff comes from. But what was really interesting about that study is that they were also able to test the timing of these people's circadian rhythms. And as much as the time taken to fall asleep between reading a book in dim light and an ebook, the difference was only 10 minutes. I mean, it came out as statistically significant, but so what if it's only 10 minutes? That's not really that much, we know that. But the meaningful one was that you saw a delay in their circadian rhythm by 90 minutes if they used the e-reader versus the printed book. And that's meaningful. That's really like if you delay your circadian rhythm by 90 minutes, that means the timing of your peak performance is delayed by 90 minutes. You find it harder to wake up in the morning. You find it harder to fall asleep. Technically, that's what should be happening. And so I've certainly been talking about that study. It's a great study. Like it is. And that study really needs to be replicated and done in different ways to really sort of understand what's going on. But I've thought about it a lot more in the past few months, because what they did is that they held a lot of the conditions constant, which is what you need to do in a sleep laboratory. But what was also happening is that people weren't necessarily having their nighttime sleep and then having those zeitgebers, those sort of cues for starting your day necessarily, like we usually do, getting up, having breakfast, moving around, getting outdoors, bright light, and so forth. And one study that we haven't managed to publish yet, it really does show if people are sedentary in the morning and they don't have those cues, after 5 consecutive days, the circadian rhythm delays. So now I'm actually reinterpreting that study and thinking, hang on, was the 90-minute delay in that particular study because of the light they had from the e-reader, or was it because they were basically delaying because they didn't have those zeitgebers in the morning and therefore their body rhythms delayed? So I really think another study has to be done where you do provide those sort of techniques versus not, with the e-reader versus the printed book, to sort of really sort of understand, does a screen actually delay your circadian rhythm?
So interesting. And so the zeitgebers are really important. And, that's probably one of my favorite words in sleep medicine, zeitgeber. And so, for anyone listening who's not familiar with that, those are essentially cues that help to regulate our circadian rhythm. And those include, they include things like light and dark and meal times and the times that we have, that we get activity and exercise and so forth. So how can we actually leverage some of these zeitgebers, especially light and dark, to regulate our circadian rhythm, but also to optimize sleep quality?
I think at least that message is getting through. And just exactly like what you said, like if we look at the different zeitgebers, light and dark are two of the most potent ones. And that's been an interesting, massive world experiment when it comes to home quarantining and COVID, isn't it? What we've seen now with the data is that even babies, we've published a study looking at baby sleep, which has also shown some social jet lag. It's the first time we've ever seen something like that, but adult sleep is also delayed. Everyone's sleep is delayed. And it's because we haven't been doing our usual morning routine, getting up, moving, having meals, getting outside. So that sort of structure is exactly what we need. And if you do that, that really tells your body clock, this is the start of the day. And then you'll start to find that you can hopefully track that and make sure that you keep that consistent. Because when you let that lapse, as we've seen throughout the whole world, then you'll start to shift a bit later. My concern has been that because we haven't had that routine, not only has there been this general shift later, but there can be individual differences as well. And there's some people that might have a longer circadian rhythm timing, and their delay means that it's really a big struggle to sort of get back to a routine, if they have to get back to school, if they have to get back to work, and they're finding it, much, much harder. But definitely when it comes to zeitgebers, people should be thinking consistent light as much as possible.
Yeah, and that timing of light is so important. And the way that I explain zeitgebers to my patients is that they're like anchors that kind of keep your circadian rhythm rooted so that you're not shifting and delaying. And, we see this a lot. You work a lot with like the teenage and adolescent population. And so that's such a big issue in that population. And another interesting, blog that you posted was about the flow state and video games and teenagers' use of them at night. So could you share what your findings were with regard to dynamic game balancing and flow state?
Yeah. And the reason we got there was because, when we were trying to sort of connect the dots, how could technology affect sleep? We thought maybe it's the stimulation. So, our very first technology in sleep study was actually giving teenagers Call of Duty in the hour before bed versus watching TV. And again, we only found like a difference of a few minutes in the time taken to fall asleep. So we had this theory, which was this arousal theory, that's the reason why people would have difficulty falling asleep after using technology. Then we explored the blue light. We couldn't find an effect there. And then we started thinking about, okay, what's going on here? And we said, okay, well, what happens is that in all of those other studies, we tried to sort of get people to fall asleep at their usual bedtime and give them something stimulating beforehand, but it wasn't actually taking longer to fall asleep. Another hypothesis was what's called the displacement hypothesis, and this was proposed by Jan van den Bolk. And the whole idea is that our activities before bed is just pushing bedtime later. So we are not behaviorally, really sort of saying, this is my bedtime. We're sort of allowing other things to dictate that. And so we sort of came up with this idea, okay, let's do another project. And this time we're not going to set their bedtime. We're going to just let them do whatever they want. Now, just imagine we've collected all of that data, and then we go to sort of analyze the data, and okay, they push their bedtime later. When it comes to explaining why, what are we going to come up with? How do we know that this happened? Why did it happen to some people more than others? And so in prepping for that, we then scoured the literature to try to sort of find what were some sort of personality characteristics that might sort of explain why some people might go to bed later after using technology versus not. And one of them was flow. Flow state had been researched back then, a little bit. And it was really sort of looking at this whole concept that you just get into this sort of different state of mind. You are absolutely absorbed in the activity that you're doing. You lose sense of time and you lose sense of your surroundings. And so then what was happening is that, you could get this from reading a book, you could get it from knitting, and clearly you could get it from playing video games. And so we thought, okay, what we'll do is we'll measure basically the flow state of people, teenagers, before they come into the lab. So we'll do it through the screening process. 2 weeks later, we had them in the lab. We said, here's a video game, guys, go for it. But just know that at 7 o'clock in the morning, we're going to wake you up. Okay. So, at some point you have to go to bed. And what we found was that definitely for some of these teenagers, when they were higher on their flow state, they naturally are someone that gets into a flow state, or at the time of playing the video game, they were getting into that flow state. They were turning off the video game an hour and a half later than the other teenagers that weren't able to get into that sort of flow state. And that's when you say that that's quite meaningful. But the interesting thing during this process is when we're learning about flow is basically almost like homeostasis. You've got to stay in that sort of zone. And if you find things are too challenging, so if we're thinking about video games and you get too challenging sort of enemies, then people start to sort of go, no, I'm out of that flow state. Or if it gets too boring, then they also get out of that flow state. So we were like, okay, we've got to find a video game where we can manipulate the different difficulty levels here. So we'll have a normal one, and maybe we'll go for something that's boring, so we can see if we can sort of bore them to sleep. And when we went out to search for video games, we found that there was barely any video games where you could manually select the difficulty level. And we're thinking, what's going on here? It hasn't been that long since, you've been able to do this. When we explored it, we realized that the technology companies already knew about flow and already had developed an algorithm and artificial intelligence called dynamic game balancing. They already knew about flow. They already knew that if a player is playing and suddenly things are getting too difficult, they'll make the enemies easier. And if they're getting through too easily, they'll make it a bit more challenging so that they keep the user in this flow state, so that they keep using the game and they keep using their product. And we were just flabbergasted that we hadn't even got to doing the research yet on testing whether this affects sleep. They've already known about it and they're already producing this technology. So that was really a big surprise. And it really was a classic way to sort of show how tech companies are way advanced than the research. And it takes ages to do the research and to catch up to them. They're way ahead.
And that's kind of scary, actually, because, and this is why I tell my patients, like, don't use social media at night. Even, and we can talk about TV in a moment, but even like smart TVs, they have these algorithms that are designed to keep you scrolling. They want you to keep watching, like on Netflix, like the next episode automatically starts playing, or, if you're on social media, it's just designed to suck you in. And so, maybe it's not just the blue light from the screen. And I think when I commented on your post about blue light, several months back, that was part of the discussion is it also the content that people are consuming on the screen, in addition to maybe some of the effects of the light or not the effects of the light. You've shown this photo, which I think is really funny, which is a picture of a child wearing blue blocking glasses, but they're reading a book. Like, they're not on a screen. They're reading an actual like analog book with a flashlight. And so it's just, it's just a really funny image, and just kind of pokes fun at the whole sleep industry and, all the gadgets and things that are out there. So I know blue blocking glasses are really popular. And I have to admit, even the glasses that I wear, I ordered the blue blocking lenses. But what are your findings on blue blocking glasses? Do we need them? Do we not need them? What do you think?
Yeah, well, the whole purpose of them is obviously to block blue light. And, if the theory is that the blue light will affect our ability to wind down and fall asleep, then you should try to block out that blue light. Now, we've been talking about screens this whole time, but there's also blue light in some of our light bulbs as well. So there's been some really nice studies that have been done where they've basically measured the amount of light that people are having in their households at night, with measuring the different sort of colors of light, across the spectrum, and finding that there's a decent amount of blue light that people are using late at night. Now, the thing is, blue blocking glasses, they could also help that as well. So you're not only blocking out the light from the screens, but you're also blocking the light from the household lights. So another lovely study has just only come out this year by Michael Gradisar's group, and they were actually analysing all these different types of blue blocking glasses, because you can get red tinted glasses, orange tinted, amber tinted, and so forth. And I think it was just an absolutely fantastic study, and it clearly shows, that classic one size does not fit all. The red ones were really great at blocking the blue lights. The amber weren't so great at blocking them that much at all. Regardless, though, it's not going to affect your time taken to fall asleep, is what we've found. And as much as some people are really using their house lights, why buy some blue blocking glasses when you can just turn the lights off? Like, this is what I'm unaware of. And our study showed that, rather than having f.lux, which actually, it wasn't statistically significant, but, people took the longest to fall asleep having f.lux as opposed to having a bright screen. But, you can dim the screen, and, that means that you're going to get less light as well, that less intense light. So I don't necessarily recommend blue blocking glasses. I think to sort of summarize, they're probably handy if you have to be around light, house light, like if we're sort of thinking about shift workers, we're thinking about potentially people that, have to sort of travel different time zones, want to minimize jet lag. When you can't control your light environment, yes, they're good. But when you can control your light environment, you can turn off the lights, you can use an app, you can turn the brightness down on your screen. You've got all these free options.
Yeah. And, and as you said, there are so many things that people can do. And so just, wearing those blue blocking glasses while playing your video game and watching Netflix with the lights fully on in your house, they're not really going to overcome all of that. And so this is where, some of this kind of like common sense strategies, but also scientifically backed strategies can be really helpful. And, one thing that we do in our house is we have our lights on dimmers. So all of our lights are on dimmers and they're connected to our Alexa device. And so everything just kind of dims in the evening. And then, I have all my devices on night shifts. So it, turns orange and blocks out the blue. And you really don't need blue blocking glasses if if you manage your environmental light exposure in those ways, and you avoid, scary movies and scrolling on social media right before bed. What are your thoughts about, this is like a classic one from sleep hygiene, that you should not have a TV in your bedroom. So let's talk about that, because I know that you have some different ideas about that. There's a specific recommendation I give to my patients that we can talk about too. So tell me your thoughts. TV in the bedroom, yay or nay?
I'm going to say yay, and I'm going to love to hear what you have to say. For me, I just found that people, when I started working with people with insomnia, they would say that they've taken their TV out of their bedroom, and they would also say, I lie there in the dark and I think about all of these things. I think about everything but nothing. And then my experiences were that if you have TV in the bedroom, that gave you a bit of a distraction from those thoughts, and people would then start to have sleepiness come to them, as opposed to worrying and being, hyper aroused and making it hard to fall asleep. And then it wasn't until we did a meta-analysis looking at all the different possible factors that could affect teenagers' sleep. And there were a lot of studies that had looked at this effect between TVs and teenagers' sleep. And what we noticed is that because TV was one of the first technological devices around, that the relationship between watching TV and sleep, it was close to zero, the overall effect from all of these different studies. And it just matched exactly what I'd heard from clinical sort of experiences working with people with insomnia. So conceptually it makes sense. And I think the other thing it does is it gives a positive sort of association with going to bed now. And keeping in mind, that's the research on TV. But like you said, TV's changed. We've got Netflix now. And the other thing is YouTube as well. And we're starting to notice that there's something that's slightly different though with YouTube. And we need to do some more research on that. It seems to be not necessarily the same as TV, but I would love to hear your experiences and what you recommend as well.
Yeah, so that's kind of along the lines of what I recommend to people. I tell them that it's actually okay if you're watching TV in bed, if it's helping you fall asleep. If you're lying there ruminating, that's not helping, and then you're creating a negative association with your bed. And we know from CBTI that we want to break that cycle. And what I tell people is that if you are going to watch something on TV or on your phone or iPad, either watch something that you've seen before, so that you're not sucked into it, waiting to see what's going to happen next, and watch something that's comforting. So if you like to watch, old episodes of Schitt's Creek, which is kind of one of my go-tos, if I want to watch something at night and I want to fall asleep, but watch something that you've seen before, and then just turn the volume down so you're not like hanging on to every word, and turn the brightness of the screen down as well. Whether you're watching it on a TV, you can usually turn the brightness down, or on your device, and that's okay. And don't stress about it. Because I feel like, people become very rigid, especially when people are struggling with insomnia. They become very rigid about all these rules around sleep, and that creates more anxiety.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's fascinating that we've come to the same conclusion, from our clinical experiences. And now, there's some research to really show that. And it's fascinating that you said Schitt's Creek, because I wanted to do a study looking at whether Schitt's Creek could actually help people fall asleep, because it gives you a positive mood. I think it was sort of got us through COVID, in 2020 in some ways. But at the same time, when I was doing my PhD, it was a bit of a sleep deprivation sort of study. And, people had to stay in bed because we were measuring their circadian rhythms. And we had a whole selection of VHS tapes and movies that they could watch. And they would struggle towards the end of this whole 48-hour sleep deprivation study to stay awake. They were falling asleep eating, they were falling asleep talking to us. But the one thing that kept them awake was Mr. Bean. It was a comedy, and people would stay awake. And I was like, wow, the power of that. So yeah, I just wonder if, the pros and cons of watching Schitt's Creek in the hour before bed. I'd love to sort of test that out.
That is really funny. And, I'm just thinking about myself. I think I would stay up to watch Mr. Bean. I don't think I would fall asleep if I had that on. I love Mr. Bean. So, well, Thank you so much for sharing all of this information today. What advice would you give to healthcare practitioners who are, maybe seeing patients in clinic who are struggling with sleep, but they themselves, don't have time to go into all of these different recommendations about sleep? They only have a few minutes with their patients. What would you suggest to anyone who's seeing patients with sleep issues?
Yeah, I guess there's different methods, and like you said, it's a time thing. If you don't have the time to deal with it, then you simply have to get knowledgeable about where to refer to, and you have to know who to refer to that really aligns with your philosophy as well, and that they're going to have the outcomes. I mean, fortunately for us, with our research, we've developed clinical trials. We got the evidence to know that our treatments actually work. We've got the data. We've gone through peer review and published them. So I guess that's one option for those people to be able to do that. What's interesting is that, about Wink is that, yes, we have, subscribers there. And as you've mentioned, you can subscribe. And I'm really passionate about the science of sleep because of essentially this topic. It took us a good sort of year or two to do that study on the iPad with teenagers and blue light and to publish it. And to have someone just sort of backhand saying, I don't believe it, or, have these sort of comments that go in the opposite, it's complete misinformation. So I'm really passionate about delivering each week to people a different topic, and all the blogs are there. We've got over 100 of them, really sort of showing about the science behind some of these things. And even if you have a study that sort of says this is what happens with sleep, I still go into it and sort of critically evaluate it, because that's part of my job as well, which was to review studies that were put up for publication. So you can subscribe for free. You could also, if you want to get a bit deeper into it, I've got a membership there as well. And that's where I've got live Q&As each month. We've got the replays there as well. We've got sleep conferences as well, where I try to look at a theme. So we've got a couple of those we've already had, and I try to sort of get different scientists from around the world. One coming up this July will be actually a little bit different. It's going to be looking at technology and sleep, and there's a different array of devices and wearables and nearables that are around that people can have a look at and know the sort of science behind them. And I guess if people want to go even deeper, we've got online courses where we teach brief behavior therapy for insomnia. We've got advanced cognitive therapy for insomnia. We've just released how to treat teenager sleep problems with bright light therapy and melatonin. And we're currently developing motivational interviewing for sleep problems as well. So we're going to be coming out with all these different sort of training modules that people can get certified in and learn it if they feel passionate about it and want to do it themselves.
That's fantastic. And where can people find your website?
It is hopefully, if they type in Wink Sleep, whether it's got a space between it or not, they'll find us. Although my surname is very unique, so you could even put Gradisar in Sleep or Gradisar in Wink, and hopefully you'll be able to Google and you'll find it.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you, Michael, for joining me today. This was so interesting, and I really appreciate your time.
And it's been lovely to chat with you and lovely to chat with someone so like-minded. And I think this is a fantastic series that you've got going. So go you.
Thanks.